My name's Lori, and I was working at a grocery store this summer after I turned 22. I was a cashier mostly, but I sometimes stocked shelves when we were short-staffed. I met a guy named William there, and he worked in the produce section. He was loud, and he was funny. Most people liked working with him because he made it a lot more fun. He was always the life of the party. He'd do impressions of the store manager when the manager wasn't around, and it always made me laugh. We talked for the first time during a slow afternoon. He leaned against the end of my register and asked me what I did when I wasn't at work. I told him I took pottery classes and went hiking. He said he'd never done either, but they both sounded better than what he did on weekends. I laughed even though it didn't sound that funny. The truth is that I already liked him, so that's probably why. Not long after that, he asked me to get a drink and I said yes. We went to see a movie and ate at a diner after. Then he asked me directly if I wanted to be his girlfriend. I said yes. I introduced him to my family at Thanksgiving that year. My sister Claire liked him, and my parents thought he was polite and funny. He helped clear the table without being asked, and talked to my dad about cars for an hour. I drove home that night, feeling like I might have actually found the one. We moved in together the following spring. We found a 2-bedroom apartment about 20 minutes from the store. It had big windows and a working fireplace that we used all the time. We split the bills evenly and took turns cooking. We argued occasionally about dishes and noise at night, but nothing serious. For most of that first year, the relationship felt good. I noticed some small red flags, but didn't take them seriously at the time. If I made plans without telling him first, he got quiet and passive-aggressive. If I came home from a friend's house later than I expected, he'd want a full explanation. I thought it was a communication style difference, and I tried to respect that. But after that, things just kept getting worse. William started asking where I was going before I left for anywhere. At first it seemed reasonable, because we lived together, and it made sense to keep each other informed. But he wanted to know who I'd be with, when I'd be back, and why I was going. If I met a friend for lunch, he'd text while I was out asking how much longer I'd be. If I didn't answer quickly, he'd call. I stopped seeing my friend Mara as often. It was easier than dealing with the questions before I left, and the mood he'd be in when I got home. I thought I was just being considerate, but looking back, I was really just letting him control me. He didn't like it when I went to my parents' house without him. He'd say things like that he felt left out, or that my family didn't really like him. Neither of those things were true, but I started bringing him along to avoid the argument. Claire asked me once if everything was okay, but I said yes and changed the subject. He never hit me. I want to be clear about that, because for a long time it was the reason I told myself things weren't that bad. He raised his voice sometimes and said things that were hard to shake, but he never got physical. The arguments got worse, and one night I told him I wanted to visit Claire by myself. She lived about 45 minutes away, and I wanted a night to catch up with her, just the two of us. He said that was fine, and then immediately started interrogating me. He said Claire didn't like him, and I was always finding excuses to get away from him. We went back and forth for over an hour. Eventually he sat down and said he was sorry. He said he'd drive me so I wouldn't have to deal with the roads. It snowed earlier in the day, and more was supposed to come. I was tired from the argument and said okay, because he was a better driver than me. I texted Claire that I was on my way, then I put my bag in the back seat and got in. William didn't say much while we drove, and it gave off a weird vibe. I wasn't paying attention to where we were going at first, but then after a while, I noticed the exits weren't right. I asked if we took a wrong turn, but he didn't answer. I reached for my phone, but he picked it up off the console and put it in his pocket. I told him to give it back, but he didn't even say anything. Then he pulled onto a rural road and stopped the car. He told me to get out, but I didn't move. I asked what he was doing, and then he said it again. There was something in his voice that terrified me, and for the first time in our relationship, I was genuinely scared. It was so bad that it made me open the door and get out. I stood on the road, and he handed me my bag from the back seat. Then he reached over and pulled the door shut, then drove away. There were no houses in sight. The snow was deep at the sides of the road, and it was still coming down. I stood there for a moment, just trying to understand what happened. Then I started walking in the direction the car came from, which was back toward the highway. The road wasn't plowed, and the snow came up to my shins in some places. I had a coat and boots, but they weren't enough for that kind of cold. My hands went numb within the first 10 minutes, and I kept them in my pockets, but it didn't help much. There were no street lights, and cloud cover blocked most of the moonlight. I could see maybe 20 feet in front of me. I walked for what felt like a long time, but then I lost track of how far I'd gone, or whether I was heading the right way. At one point, I stopped and couldn't remember which direction I'd been walking, so I picked one and kept going. Then a set of headlights came around a corner, so I went into the center of the road and waved both arms. The truck slowed down and stopped. The driver opened the door and asked if I was all right. I told him I needed help. He got me into the cab and turned the heat up and called emergency services from his radio. He didn't ask a lot of questions, which was a relief for me because I was so embarrassed. I ended up getting a ride to Claire's house, and I stayed there for the next few weeks. We called the cops the next day, even though I didn't want to. He moved out of our apartment while I was still at Claire's, and I eventually went back to get my stuff. I took about 2 weeks off from work, and when I went back, everyone knew what happened. William was fired as soon as our boss found out, and I still don't know what happened to him. Nobody from my work still stays in touch with him, and luckily, he's never tried to contact me. It's still hard to know what he was thinking that night. There was a real chance that I could have frozen to death out there, and he would have been at fault. In a way, he was really lucky that I survived. This is about a girlfriend I had a few years ago, and it still confuses me whenever I think about it. I'd only had one relationship before this, so I didn't know how to deal with a toxic partner. That's why I let it get as bad as it did. I met Sarah at a backyard barbecue that my friend Derek had at his house, and about 20 people showed up. I didn't know everyone there, but everyone was cool, so I was happy to hang around and see how the day went. Sarah arrived with her friend Megan, who I went to college with. Megan introduced us near the cooler, and we ended up standing there talking for the next hour without really meaning to. Sarah was easy to talk to, and she had a good sense of humor. She worked in marketing at a food company, and she grew up about 2 hours north of the city. She told a funny story about a camping trip that went horribly wrong, and I laughed harder than I had in a while. She was attractive, and she was around the same age as me. We were both 24. She was medium height with dark hair, and she smiled a lot. I noticed that she was the type who could walk into a room and make friends with everyone, and I found that appealing. I was more reserved by nature, and people like her always interested me. We exchanged numbers before she left that evening. I texted her the following week, and we went for dinner at a casual Italian place near her apartment. The conversation picked up right where it left off, and overall, it went really well. We went out a few more times over the next 2 weeks, and by August we were officially a couple. The first few months were fun. We went to concerts, tried new restaurants, and spent weekends exploring different parts of the city. She was spontaneous, and she pulled me to do things I wouldn't have otherwise. She had a lot of friends, and she was always planning something. However, I did notice her temper early on, even if I didn't take it seriously enough at first. When something annoyed her, her mood changed fast. The first time I saw it, I figured it was just a bad day, but the second and third times, I started to understand that it was just part of who she was. I let it go and focused on the parts of the relationship I liked. That was probably my first real mistake. By the time we'd been together for about 8 months, the arguments became a regular thing. They didn't start as anything serious. We'd disagree about plans, or she'd feel like I wasn't being attentive enough, or I'd say something she took the wrong way. Within a few minutes of any friction, she'd be raising her voice and saying things to hurt my feelings. Afterwards, she'd cool down and act like it wasn't a big deal, and I'd be left trying to figure out what just happened. I brought it up with her twice. The first time, she listened and apologized, then said she knew she had a temper and she was working on it. The second time, the conversation about her temper turned into another argument. After that, I stopped raising it directly and just tried to manage things carefully around her, which wasn't a great solution, but it kept the peace. Then a close friend of mine named Phil was having a birthday party. He rented out the back room of a bar and invited around 40 people. It was a good night. The music wasn't too loud, the drinks were reasonably priced, and Phil was in a great mood, so I was happy to be there. Sarah came with me, and she seemed to enjoy herself for most of the evening. She got along well with Phil, and spent time talking to a few people she met before through me. But at around 10 o'clock, she thought she saw me flirting with a girl named Andrea, who I knew since university. There was nothing to it, and we were just catching up, but Sarah looked mad, and I could tell she was going to tear into me eventually. We didn't fight at the party. She kept it together in front of everyone, which I appreciated. But on the way to the car afterward, she was quiet, which was unusual for her. When we got onto the highway, she started talking about it. She asked me directly about Andrea, and I explained the same thing I just said. She was an old friend, nothing more. Sarah didn't seem to believe me, though. She started yelling at me, and after a few minutes of that, I lost my temper too. I was doing about 100 kilometers an hour in the center lane when she grabbed the steering wheel. The car swerved hard towards the left lane, and a transport truck was moving beside us. I yanked the wheel back hard to the right to avoid hitting it. For a few seconds I had almost no control. The truck's horn blared and I saw its headlights in the side mirror. I steered hard and hit the brakes, then managed to get the car onto the right shoulder. I thought a close call like that was going to be enough to calm both of us down, but she was still mad. Then she started hitting me wildly. She got me mostly in the shoulder, but a few punches hit the side of my head. I grabbed both of her wrists and held them. She struggled and then stopped when she got tired. Then I told her to get out of the car. She resisted at first, so I came around to her side, opened the door, and got her out onto the shoulder. She stood there and yelled at me, but I just got back into the car and drove away. I drove about a mile down the highway before I pulled off onto the side again. I sat there for a few minutes with the engine running. I called the police and told them there was a woman alone on the highway shoulder and gave them the approximate location. The dispatcher asked if she was injured, and I said no. They said they'd send someone to check on her. I didn't explain the rest of it, I just said she needed a ride. I drove home, then I sat on the couch for a while and didn't turn anything on. My phone buzzed a few times, but I didn't look at it. Then eventually I went to bed, but I didn't sleep much. I ignored her messages for a few days, but then I sent her a single text telling her that it was over. She tried to call me many times and sent tons of messages, but I ignored them, and eventually she stopped. A few months later, I ran into Megan, who introduced us originally. She looked uncomfortable when she saw me and said she heard things didn't work out. I told her it was fine and that I was doing well. The truth is that I just didn't want to get into it with her. I don't know if she knew Sarah was crazy or if that side of her only came out with boyfriends. If she knew, then a warning would have been nice, but I'm over it now. I met my last boyfriend in our first year of college. We started dating after working together on a group project, and for a long time things were good between us. His name was Austin, and he was smart, funny, and usually easy to get along with. We spent most of our college years together and stayed together after graduation. By the time everything happened, we'd been a couple for almost 5 years. During the last year of our relationship, things changed. We argued all the time, and it was usually about nothing. It was just what we did. Sometimes it was a little more serious, though. We disagreed about money, where we wanted to live, and what our future should look like. Sometimes we could go a few days without fighting, but eventually something would start another argument. I still loved him, and I believed he loved me too. That was why I kept trying to make things work. Looking back, I think we were both unhappy for a long time, but neither of us wanted to admit it. A few weeks before everything fell apart, Austin suggested that we take a trip together. He said we needed time away from work so we could really be together. He found a cabin on Airbnb and rented it for the weekend. We drove there on a Friday afternoon, and on the way, we got along really well. It was probably the longest we'd gone without fighting in a while. When we got there were no other houses nearby, and the nearest gas station was about 20 minutes away, according to the directions we looked up. The cabin had a wood stove, a couch, a kitchen area, and one bedroom, and there was no cell service once we arrived. Austin joked that it would force us to focus on each other. I laughed, but I felt nervous about being so isolated. The first few hours went reasonably well. We unpacked our bags, then made dinner together. Then for a little while, it felt like old times. While we were eating, we started discussing where we wanted to live in the future. Then within minutes, we were arguing again. The conversation then turned into accusations about old disagreements that neither of us had forgotten. The rest of the evening followed the same pattern. We would calm down for a few minutes, and then another disagreement would start. Every attempt to fix things seemed to make everything worse. By late evening, both of us were frustrated and exhausted. We sat in silence for a while, and I thought that the entire trip had been a mistake. Then at around midnight, we started arguing again, but I don't even remember what caused it. I was standing near the stove, while Austin paced around the room, and he seemed angrier than I ever saw him before. I told him that we should stop talking and get some sleep, but instead of calming down, he got even more upset. Then he grabbed the metal poker that was beside the stove. At first I thought he was just gesturing with it while he argued, and for some reason, I didn't even feel like it was a threat. I guess it was just too hard to believe he would hurt me. But then he swung it and got me right in the side of the head. Everything went black, and I must have passed out. When I opened my eyes again, the cabin was dark, and my head hurt so badly that I felt sick. For several seconds, I didn't even understand where I was. Then I tried to move, but my wrists were tied behind my back. I panicked and started pulling frantically, but I couldn't get free. Then I was able to feel with my fingers, and I realized that I was tied up with some kind of tape, probably the clear packing tape that they use on boxes. Then I calmed down enough to look around, and Austin was pacing at the other side of the cabin. The second he noticed I was awake, he stopped walking and stared at me. Then I asked him what he was doing. He started talking so quickly that it was hard to follow. He said I was going to destroy his life and tell everyone he was a terrible person. He kept repeating the same thing over and over. For hours I talked to him as calmly as possible. Every time he got mad, I tried to reassure him that it was going to be fine. That was obviously a lie, because I knew all along that I was calling the cops as soon as I could. I wasn't trying to save the relationship anymore. I was trying to stay alive. While he talked, I looked around the room for anything that I could use to escape. Eventually, I noticed a broken wooden chair near the other wall. One of the metal brackets underneath the chair had snapped loose, and a sharp edge was sticking out. The chair was just close enough that I thought I might be able to reach it without being too obvious. I started sliding across the floor a little at a time, whenever Austin wasn't paying attention. I finally got to the chair, then I started trying to cut the tape. My wrists hurt every time it scraped against the metal edge, but I kept working at them. Austin kept on pacing and talking to me, but he still didn't realize what I was doing. Sometimes he sat down for a few minutes, but most of the time he was standing up. There were a few times where he asked whether I still loved him, and I told him whatever I thought would keep him calm. It was harder to get through the tape than I would have thought, and eventually, Austin fell asleep on the couch. Once I noticed that, I didn't have to be so careful anymore. I started struggling harder, and eventually I got free. I got up and opened the door, then stepped outside. I wasn't wearing shoes, and I didn't take the time to grab my jacket. I just ran down the gravel road as fast as I could. The rocks cut into my feet, and every step hurt, but I kept moving. I looked over my shoulder constantly, because I was convinced Austin would come after me the second he realized I was gone. The road seemed endless, and after walking for what felt like forever, I finally heard an engine in the distance. A utility truck appeared around a bend in the road. I was covered in dirt and blood. My feet were cut from running barefoot, and I could barely stand upright. He helped me into the truck and called the cops. The paramedics checked out my head, and they told me that I needed to get to a hospital as soon as possible. I later heard that the police went to the cabin later that morning, and Austin was still there. He was arrested for attacking me, but he denied it all. I don't want to go into the legal stuff too much, because it's boring, and to be honest, I don't understand most of it. But Austin did time in prison for the attack. I ended up making a recovery, but I still have a small scar near my hairline from it. You can't see it when my hair is down, but I notice it every once in a while. I can still hardly believe the way he snapped on me, especially since I thought I knew him so well.